In the last lecture, we talked about an ancient Babylonian hero story. Today, we're going to look at the ancient Babylonian creation story, the Enuma Elish, also called the Enuma Elish, which probably originated a few centuries after the Epic of Gilgamesh around 1100 BCE. Because of its focus on creation, the Enuma Elish is very different from the Epic of Gilgamesh. In fact, there are some clear parallels between the Enuma Elish and the creation story in the Bible. So those two stories are often compared with one another, even though they come from different communities. The Enuma Elish is named for the first two words that begin the story, what we call the incipit or the opening. The first two words mean when on high, and this opening tells us that the story we're about to hear is set in the heavens, among the gods. The story describes the creation of the world by multiple gods as a result of their struggle with one another for power. The Enuma Elish opens with two primordial gods, Apsu and Tiamat. Apsu is traditionally understood to be the god of fresh water, and Tiamat is the goddess of seawater. The myth begins with these lines. When on high heaven was not named, and the earth beneath did not yet bear a name, and the primeval Apsu who fathered them, and Chaos, Tiamat, the mother of them both, their waters were mingled together as one, and no field was formed, no marsh was to be seen. When of the gods none had been called into being, and none bore a name, and no destinies were ordained, at that time the gods were created in the midst of the heavens. There's a lot packed into those opening lines that we want to notice. First of all, there's a polytheistic worldview presented here. Like ancient European cultures such as the Greeks, the Romans, the Celts, and Norse peoples, the Babylonians believed in multiple gods rather than a single, all-powerful, all-knowing god. In addition, these opening lines refer to the fact that these multiple gods were created. They have not existed for all time. Only Apsu and Tiamat are considered primordial or pre-existent. The rest of the gods are created, called into being after the creation story begins. As the Babylonian creation story wraps up its introductory section, the male Apsu and the female Tiamat have come together and produced offspring. These multiple new gods are said to have been created in the midst of the heavens. Now, some scholars believe that this actually refers to Tiamat's womb, in which case the next events occur within her divine body. At a certain point, this starts to become hard to visualize, so it might be easier to think of everything that follows occurring on a vast heavenly stage. This creation myth is certainly very different from the biblical creation story, and we're going to see more differences as we continue. At the same time, however, there are also some strong parallels between the Babylonian creation story and Genesis 1. Both stories have been considered explicitly religious, in that they discuss God's present and active at the beginning of creation. They touch on themes of human creation and destiny. And they refer to supernatural realms like the heavens, realms outside of our everyday experience. As I mentioned in the last lecture, stories from Mesopotamia and the Middle East embrace elements of what we understand as religion and mythology, intertwining them very comfortably. While we may hear the Genesis story very differently than we hear the Enuma Elish, they're actually very similar in their thematic concerns. As the story moves forward, a problem develops. The text says, "The divine brothers banded together. They disturbed Tiamat as they surged back and forth. They troubled her mood. By their hilarity in the abode of heaven, Apsu could not lessen their clamor, and Tiamat was speechless at their ways. Their doings were loathsome." In layman's terms, the story is saying that Apsu and Tiamat's sons were acting like brats. They were fighting and they were partying all the time. Apsu got angry. Tiamat developed a migraine, and the divine parents reached their limit. This is when things get really interesting. Apsu, the father god, decides to fix the problem by killing his sons. Tiamat doesn't like this, so she warns one of the sons, Ea, that Apsu is plotting to kill him along with his brothers. Ea responds by using an incantation to put Apsu into a deep sleep, and then he murders his father. At that point, Ea becomes the supreme god. He and his consort, Damkina, produce a son, Marduk, who is known as a storm god. From this point on in the story, Marduk becomes the central character in the myth. Meanwhile, Tiamat is mourning the death of her husband. While she didn't like the idea of Apsu killing their sons, she didn't necessarily want him murdered. So she decides to avenge his death. She creates 11 monsters of the deep to help her wage battle against Ea and the other gods. She also takes a second husband, Kingu, one of Tiamat and Apsu's own sons, and raises him to the status of supreme deity. The gods who had allied themselves with Ea start to become concerned about Tiamat establishing a new supreme deity and creating an army of monsters. They become afraid of the threat that this poses to them. Marduk, the new kid on the block, makes a deal with them. He promises that if they make him their supreme deity, he will save them from Tiamat and her army. However, the gods have to agree to let him remain supreme deity after he has defeated Tiamat. Well, the gods decide that they've got no choice, and they agree. And Ea, Marduk's father, voluntarily surrenders leadership to Marduk. Marduk challenges Tiamat to battle, and he defeats her, killing her. In a famous passage, Marduk cuts Tiamat's body into two parts. The text reads, "Marduk paused to view her dead body. He split her like a shellfish into two parts. Half of her he set up and sealed as sky, and then he pulled down the bar and posted guards. He ordered them not to allow her waters to escape." Marduk creates the heavens from one half of Tiamat's dismembered body and the earth from the other half. The myth states that the tears from her eyes were the sources for the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. He gives the gods Anu, Enlil, and Ea dominion over the heavens, the air, and the water. Then he creates the sun, the moon, and the stars in their constellations, and the planets. Marduk then takes control of time itself, and he establishes a calendar by setting the heavenly bodies in regular motion relative to one another. He creates the yearly calendar controlling the motions of the stars, the planets, and even the weather. Once he's victorious, Marduk forces the other gods to keep their promise and to serve him as the supreme deity. He establishes his throne in Babylon. Then Marduk kills Tiamat's offspring and her second husband, Kingu. From Kingu's body, he creates humanity. The text says, "The gods bound Kingu, holding him before Ea. They imposed on him his guilt and severed his arteries. Out of his blood, they fashioned mankind. Then Marduk imposed service on humanity and let free the gods." As the story comes to an end, Marduk is permanently established as supreme king and lord over all the gods. But he has released the gods from cultic service to him, reassigning these worship and cultic responsibilities to humanity. In effect, Marduk is now the supreme god over a group of gods, all of whom dominate human beings. At the end of the narrative portion of the Enuma Elish, the gods declare that he rules over the gods of heaven and earth. The final tablet of the Enuma Elish describes the gathering of all the gods in their council chamber after Marduk has finished the work of creation. The gods call out the 50 names of Marduk, which spell out the qualities that make him fit to be the supreme god. The implication is clear. Humanity should praise and worship Marduk just as the gods do. Tablets containing the Enuma Elish were first discovered in the mid-19th century by Austin Henry Layard, an English archaeologist and a scholar of cuneiform, one of the earliest writing systems we know of. Now, ancient cuneiform writing started as largely pictorial. eventually evolving into a system in which the symbols became more abstract and represented sounds and letters. If you want, you can buy t-shirts and coffee mugs today on the web with passages from the Enuma Elish in cuneiform on them. Anyway, Laird found fragments of tablets in the ruins of a library in Nineveh, present-day Mosul, Iraq. The text found on the fragments, which was written in an ancient Babylonian dialect, was first published in 1876 by George Smith, the same British Assyriologist who discovered and translated the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Enuma Elish is about 1,000 lines long, and it was written on a total of 7 numbered clay tablets, with an average of about 142 lines on each tablet. Most of tablet 5 is missing, but we have virtually all of the rest of the story. The tablets that were found in Nineveh are dated to the 7th century BCE, so roughly coinciding with the fall of the Neo-Assyrian Empire to the Babylonians, and about a century later than the Iliad and the Odyssey. However, there's a bit of uncertainty surrounding the date of the story itself. Some scholars believe that the story itself goes back to the 16th or maybe even the 18th century BCE, while others think it's a bit more recent, originating about 1100 BCE. Either way, the story is pretty old by our standards. The Enuma Elish does what any good creation myth does. It explains where the material world came from. This particular creation story claims that we humans currently live in half of the dismembered body of a defeated goddess. Now, the sky is her other half, and all the other basic elements of our universe, the sun, the moon, and the stars, are fashioned from her bodily remains as well. It may be gruesome, but it's an explanation. Second, the Enuma Elish presents a well-developed view of the nature and history of the gods. The Enuma Elish teaches polytheism, the presence of multiple gods who interact with one another and, eventually, with humans. The myth also tells us that there was a primordial age in which the gods fought openly with one another. And it then presents a specific form of polytheism that we call henotheism. Henotheism is when one god among many is established as a supreme or a chief god. In this case, the Enuma Elish describes how Marduk came to be recognized as the supreme deity. According to the myth, Marduk used brute force to establish his supremacy. He battled other gods to the death, or he threatened them with death in order to secure his position. But despite these violent tendencies, Marduk actually ushered in a new era of orderliness. It may not be absolute peace, but it's a lot calmer than things were in primordial times. So to sum up, the Enuma Elish presents the history of the gods and explains how the supreme god came into being. Third, the Enuma Elish tells us something about the position of human beings in the world and in relationship to the gods. The description of human creation is actually a bit unnerving. Marduk is said to have devised a cunning plan. Now, this specific phrase is used twice in the story, once to refer to Marduk splitting Tiamat's body in two, and second to refer to the act of the creation of humanity. Corruptions in the text make it a bit difficult to determine exactly how humanity is created, but most scholars agree that Ea beheads Kingu at Marduk's request, and then Kingu's blood is used to make human beings. Ea then imposes servitude on them. Despite the fact that human beings are made with divine blood, they have no special status in the created world and no special relationship with the gods. Instead, they seem to have been created to do a specific job, to worship and serve the gods. The narrative suggests that after the world has been created, the other gods complain to Marduk that they want shrines and worship. Marduk apparently creates humanity to fulfill this need. Thus, humanity wasn't even part of Marduk's original plan. The Enuma Elish teaches that we're a kind of afterthought, subordinate to the gods, and our lot in life is to serve and worship them. This probably reflected the day-to-day lives of most ancient Babylonians who were subordinate to their rulers and who had very little choice about their social status, their work, and what they owed to the governing powers. There's also a strong geographical component at work here. The myth clearly reflects the river valley landscape in which it was composed. The two primordial gods, Apsu and Tiamat, represent freshwater and saltwater respectively. Now, this may be the result of the fact that the Tigris and the Euphrates freshwater rivers ultimately flow into the Persian Gulf, which is saltwater. In addition, Marduk's conflict with Tiamat has been read as an allegory of a common sight on the Mediterranean shores, a violent storm moving over the sea. So clearly, the fundamental components of the myth reflect common natural elements in ancient Near Eastern life. In addition, most scholars tend to agree on the social context of the Enuma Elish. Evidence indicates that the myth was recited publicly during Akitu, the Babylonian New Year festival, as part of a ritual ceremony. If this is the case, then it means that in the middle of a New Year's celebration, Babylonians would have been told that Babylon was specifically chosen by Marduk as an earthly home for the gods. They would have been reminded how the world came into being, and how Marduk in particular became the supreme deity. The myth ends with a recitation of Marduk's 50 names praising him. Now, this suggests that a key part of the New Year's ritual was worship of Marduk himself. This isn't unusual. Many cultures include annual festivals that focus on a supreme deity, praising him, and asking him to continue to maintain the universe that he himself established. At the same time, there may be something more subtle going on here as well. Stories about ancient times often serve as a foil for the present. Stories recited within the context of an annual public ritual usually have a public message. Scholar Walter Burkert argues that stories told about the gods and their conflicts can often be understood to reflect existing conflicts between humans, and I agree with him on this point. In the period during which the Enuma Elish was composed, tribal communities battled for control of territories in Mesopotamia, and power was tenuous at best. There was always someone eyeing a king's power and plotting to take it from him. As part of an effort to maintain some stability, the Babylonian king's power to rule was renewed ritually in a public ceremony at the annual New Year festival. In a ritual ostensibly focused on Marduk, the king reminded the people that power was derived from brute strength, and, just like Marduk, the king was not afraid to wield that power. It wouldn't take much for the masses to see a parallel between the supreme god's power and the king's power. Just as Marduk destroyed those who threatened him, so would the king. And just as Marduk created humans to serve him, the king expected his subjects to serve him as well. So the story of the divine conflict should be viewed as a kind of cautionary tale for human Babylonians. Burkert also argues that Babylonian cosmogonies, or cosmogonic myths, myths that explain the beginning of the cosmos, served functions that we in the modern West tend not to think about. He says that they were used as healing incantations. In ancient Babylon, illnesses were explained as the body disintegrating, reverting back to chaos and disaster. By contrast, Babylonian cosmogonies spoke of the move out of chaos toward order and integration. As a result, cosmogonic myths were recited over the ill to help move the body back toward order and health. So Burkert claims that Babylonian myths were used as charms against a toothache or a headache, or for facilitating childbirth. A New Year's festival also celebrated a fresh start, a new beginning in the calendar, and it would be appropriate to establish order in that new calendar. By incorporating the creation myth into the New Year's celebration, people were reminded of the chaos and the danger that preceded this age. It might even suggest that such chaos continued to lurk out on the edges of civilization, always threatening to intrude. The New Year ritual kept chaos at bay, a kind of a collective charm warding off evil from the community. The story of the Enuma Elish also raises many other questions for scholars of ancient religions. Frankly, there's a whole lot of violence in this creation account. My students tend to react pretty negatively to all the blood and the gore in this myth, and they use this violence to just dismiss the myth as primitive. But the violence is actually instructive. It gives us a glimpse into the experiences and concerns of the ancient Mesopotamian world. So let's remember our history. We know that the oldest written record of the Enuma Elish is dated to the 7th century BCE, but the story had probably been circulating since at least 1100 BCE. We don't have many written records from this period, but we do know that there was extended political upheaval and military conflict during this time. The Neo-Assyrian Empire came to power in 911 BCE, and it lasted until the fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE. In fact, it may be to violence that we owe our knowledge of the Enuma Elish. Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, established a library where the art and writings of other cultures could be preserved, which was really a very progressive idea. This library included items from Babylonia. Scholars tend to think that when Nineveh was sacked, a great fire destroyed the library. However, instead of destroying the tablets, the fire actually baked them, preserving them for posterity. So ironically, the fire designed to decimate the library may have actually helped to preserve the writings, including the tablets containing the Enuma Elish. One other interesting twist on this story. As we noted earlier, the Enuma Elish tablets were discovered in the late 19th century. When George Smith published the myth in 1876, he published it under the title, The Chaldean Genesis. Copies of this other Genesis flew off the shelves. It was one of the best-selling books of its time. Now keep in mind that the Enuma Elish is not the only Babylonian creation story, and it's not even the oldest Babylonian creation story we know of. However, it's the best-known Babylonian creation story. Why was this book so popular? Well, it's because the creation account presented in the Enuma Elish was explicitly compared with the Genesis story, virtually as soon as it was discovered. The title, The Chaldean Genesis, begs you to compare the Babylonian story with the biblical story, and people took the bait. Now, Genesis was compiled over time, possibly beginning as early as 950 BCE, but its last significant revision in its current form probably occurred in the mid-6th century BCE. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the oldest written record of the Enuma Elish dates to the 7th century BCE. So this means that the Enuma Elish predates Genesis. There are some clear differences between the Enuma Elish and the biblical material. The God of Genesis is a single, all-powerful male God who seemingly has no beginning or end. He creates the world alone in an orderly, peaceful, deliberate process. The world is created from primordial stuff, not from the body of a god or a goddess. Humanity is created at the end of this process, and Genesis suggests that human beings are pretty special, the culmination of creation. The first man is animated by God's breath. He's given a name, and he's given dominion, or at least stewardship, over the entire created world. The Enuma Elish presents quite a different picture. Humanity is created not from the dust of the earth and God's breath, but from the corpse of a defeated deity. There's no first human. Human beings as a group are collected to serve Marduk, and much like slave labor. And human beings are servants, masters of virtually nothing. Again, this probably reflected the social world in which they lived. The discovery of the Enuma Elish was one of several key events in the 19th century that forced scholars to put the biblical myths into conversation with other cultures' sacred texts. In this period, archaeological discoveries made it clear that many civilizations in the ancient Near East had sophisticated creation narratives. The initial hope of Christian theologians had been that the Enuma Elish would repeat the story as presented in Genesis, thus bolstering the credibility of the Bible more broadly. Obviously, instead, the Enuma Elish raised questions. The differences between the Enuma Elish and Genesis led scholars to wonder what kind of relationship, if any, there was between the two texts. Archaeological research and other textual finds suggested that economic trade and political changes in the ancient Near East led to cultural exchange as well. And it seems that myths were transmitted throughout various communities. Many scholars came to the conclusion that the Genesis creation story had roots in other ancient Near Eastern myths, especially the myths of the Mesopotamian civilizations, including the Enuma Elish. There are some clear common elements. In particular, both Genesis and the Enuma Elish describe the creation as a multi-step process. They both characterize creation as not merely the creation of substances in distinct form, but also the establishment of some kind of order to replace chaos. Also, in Genesis, humanity is made in God's image. Now, this is distinctly not the case in the Enuma Elish. Finally, and perhaps most important, the violence that characterizes the Enuma Elish is completely absent in the Genesis creation account. The Genesis story gives humanity dominion over the created world. The Enuma Elish definitely does not. Humans worship. They do not rule over nature. So what do we do with the fact that there are similarities and differences between the Enuma Elish and the Genesis creation accounts? Many scholars have decided that the Genesis story was developed in response to the Mesopotamian myth as a direct challenge. In other words, the authors of Genesis knew the Enuma Elish story, and they disagreed with the worldview it described. Certain elements suggest that the authors of Genesis were very familiar with ancient Mesopotamian creation myths and had these myths in mind as they crafted Genesis. You may recall that the very first line of Genesis chapter 1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Some scholars have noted that the phrase heavens and the earth was the Akkadian name for the entire Babylonian pantheon. It may actually be that with this opening phrase, Genesis is taking on Babylon, declaring that the God of the Israelites was superior to all the Mesopotamian gods, including Marduk. In this view, Genesis was a rebuttal to the Babylonian worldview, arguing for the superiority of the Israelite God, a peaceful, orderly creation process, and an intimate relationship between the divine and the human. Some Christian scholars have noted that the Babylonian gods were associated with natural elements, while the biblical God is described as completely distinct from and superior to the natural world. This rhetorical move in Genesis can be seen as asserting the supremacy of the Israelite God over the Mesopotamian gods, and rejecting any inclination to divinize natural elements, such as the sun, the moon, the rivers, etc. Keeping these differences in mind, it's worth noting that Genesis 1 and the Enuma Elish seem to share one thing in common: a deep desire to portray the contemporary world as qualitatively distinct from the pre-creation past. Both accounts suggest that there was a time before this time, before the earth as we know it existed, and that in that ancient time, chaos prevailed. In both accounts, a supreme deity is responsible for the ordered world in which we now live. Both the Enuma Elish and Genesis teach ancient listeners to appreciate whatever orderliness they do have in their day-to-day lives. The pre-creation chaos or formless and void status is scary. So what we have now may not be perfect, but it's better than it used to be, so don't mess with it. We move now away from the Mesopotamian world to a neighboring ancient land, Egypt. Egyptian history differed markedly from Babylonian history. The peoples of these two civilizations occupied different landscapes, different socio-political worlds, and different cultural movements. You won't have any trouble seeing what makes Egyptian mythology distinctive, but it's worth listening with one ear for the themes it has in common with Babylonian mythology as well. Concerns about the gods' power over human beings, an intimate relationship with the landscape and the natural world in general, and a strong sense of one's place in the social system. It makes quite a contrast with the secular, urbanized, ever-changing society many people live in today.